He was standing on my porch like he owned the place, his huge chest puffed out and a smug grin on his face. I never thought I'd have to defend my own home from an intruder, let alone one who was welcomed by my wife. He was her boyfriend, not just a random acquaintance. When she told me a few weeks ago, she wasn't gentle. Seeing someone else, it's just different, it doesn't mean I don't care about you. The phrase stayed with me each night as I lay in bed and gazed up at the ceiling, feeling like I was a pair of old shoes that needed to be replaced. I didn't shout, throw things, or quarrel with her. I just listened, nodded, and continued as if nothing was wrong with my world. And now she was standing on my doorstep, daring to challenge me. Threshold, as though he was supposed to, his voice loud and irritating, his fragrance heavy and oppressive. Man, you've lost. His comments were brimming with condescension. Just accept it. She should have someone who can care for her, and is not weak. The word weak made me feel something, but I kept it to myself. I was standing there with my arms folded and resting lightly against the door frame instead of giving him the gratification of watching me respond. He walked around my living room like he owned it, which was almost funny. He made comments about my art, furniture, and even the cheap beer in my fridge, which was unworthy of his sophisticated taste. My wife was sitting quietly on the couch, her gaze flitting between us like a referee who doesn't know the rules. She wasn't going to step in, but I couldn't tell if she was amused, embarrassed, or regarded himself as the alpha, the dominant force. But I saw something else, a guy too inebriated by his own conceit to see the calm before the storm, and the storm was coming. I allowed him to mock me, denigrate me, and brag about himself like a rooster in a henhouse. I've always been a patient person, but this self-proclaimed alpha. False knowledge. I stood there with my arms crossed out of patience. He squinted at me and said, "You're too quiet, that's why she's with Titch me. Women want someone who takes charge. You look like you just take whatever's thrown at you." I nodded, pretending to ponder his words. He mistook my silence for submission, a classic mistake of the loud insecure. You see, I've learned that true power doesn't need to announce itself. Moment is right, it acts decisively. As he continued his monologue, I watched him closely, his posture, his movements, even the way he glanced at my wife, as if expecting her approval. Everything about him screamed insecurity masked as confidence. I let him think he was winning, that he was in control. "Man, I almost feel sorry for you," he chuckled, leaning back on my couch like it was his. Fixed on his, he didn't know it yet, but every word he uttered was digging his grave deeper. Every smirk, every laugh, every arrogant gesture fuel for the storm brewing inside me. And then there was my wife sitting there with her arms folded. She hadn't said much since the circus began. Her silence was more damning than any word she could have shared. The situation pressing down on me, but I refused to let it crush me. Instead, I let it sharpen my focus. The house felt smaller with him in it, like his ego was taking up all the air. But I remained calm and collected, because storms don't start with thunderclaps right away. They start with a shift in the wind, a quiet stillness that lingers in the air. Ready to let go of your pride and move on. It's better for everyone if you do. Unfolded my arms, letting a small smile play on my lips. "You're right," I said calmly this time. "I accept the situation." He blinked, momentarily thrown off by my agreement. He didn't realize the trap he had just walked into. I extended a hand. "Gee, we're old friends," and said, "Now we're talking." I walked slowly as I guided him to the door, and measured the quiet before the storm passed. When we entered the driveway, it was time to let the winds roar. I looked back to the house and saw my wife standing in the doorway with her arms folded and her face unreadable. "All right, let her observe. She needed to see what happens when you disturb a man's haven." I was prepared for the impending storm. I had meticulous sweeping shadows that spread across the tarmac as the sun sank below the horizon. The air was thick. He walked out with confidence, his chest puffed out, as if he were entering a prize battle he had already won, and he remarked, rolling his shoulders with a tension you could almost taste, "You've grown a spine at last. You took too long." I didn't answer right away. I allowed the pause to grow while my stare pierced his haughtiness for a sec. Pacing around his prey like a wolf. "This need not become unpleasant. Simply acknowledge that you are unable to compete, and we will end the matter." I cocked my head, observing him like one might watch a very noisy peacock. Although he was entertaining, his bluster was expected. Anger, irritation, possibly even desperation. That was what he wanted. He didn't understand that I wasn't going to give him what he wanted. "You're right," I calmly but firmly stated. "House, and now you're on my driveway, acting like you own the place, so let's resolve this now, right here." That knocked him off balance. His eyes narrowed, and he stopped pacing. "What do you say?" I said, moving closer. "Show me right here if you want to prove you're the better man." My fists itched to clench as his shrill, irritating laughter reverberated down the silent. He was getting ready for a sparring battle. He removed his jacket and threw it onto the hood of my car. He cracked his knuckles and muttered, "All right, old man, let's check out what you have." He was unaware that while he was strutting around like a rooster in a henhouse, I had been psychologically and physically preparing for this moment. I had been waiting, planning and calculating in silence. I moved slowly and deliberately as I entered. This had nothing to do with regaining my pride or demonstrating my masculinity. I had to set a boundary, protect my house, and prove to him and my wife that I wasn't the doormat they thought I was. He squared up. Leighton, get this done quickly, smiled, and I focused on my breathing pattern, posture, and intention as my wife watched from the doorway. Was delivered quickly but insufficiently, so I easily sidestepped it and let him stagger forward while I stayed calm and prepared for the first time. I noticed a glimmer of doubt in his eyes, and his confidence was all bluster and no substance. The concert was just starting, and the stage was mine. It started with a swing, a broad awkward arrogance, like a bull charging at a matador. Off balance, he recovered with a smirk that almost concealed his surprise and whispered, "You're faster than I thought." I didn't respond because my silence cut through his heart with each unsaid moment. He attacked me again, this time with a barrage of overpowering blows. I hooked his wrist mid-swing on the third, avoided the second, and blocked the first. I let off and he staggered back holding onto his arm. The sneer had vanished to be replaced by fear and frustration. He spat, shaking out his wrist. "Lucky shot, we'll see how you manage this." I let him come this time as he charged again, his weight twisted against me. As I felt the shock of his body colliding with mine, his thump reverberated across the driveway. As he struck the ground hard, I took a step back so he see. Bite it was that his cheeks flushed and he scurried to his feet, letting out a guttural shout. He swung at me madly without planning or strategy. With ease I avoided each spray, fueling my resolve and draining his vitality. I stepped in as he staggered, struggling to breathe. A clean blow to the shoulder sent him reeling, and a swift move. "Carefully, you're trying to seize what belongs to me in my home and on my land. That is foolishness, not bravery." I pushed harder to let my words sink in even though he fought beneath me. "You believe that you are the alpha?" I asked, leaning closer. "The strongest man in the room doesn't need to prove it, but you're nothing but noise." For a moment he stopped, struggling, the fight drained out of him as reality set in. I stood, leaving him sprawled on. As I walked toward the house, my wife stood in the doorway with an unreadable expression. I met her gaze and said, "Just clean up your mess behind me." He groaned, clutching his arm as he tried to stand. The alpha was broken, his limbs battered, and his ego shattered. The duel was over and the storm had passed, but the damage had only begun. Believed I'd accepted my role as the defeated husband, maybe even found comfort in the idea that I was too passive to react. But now she couldn't ignore the truth staring her in the face. "I wasn't defeated. I told you to clean up your mess," I said again, my voice sharper this time, cutting through the stunned silence. Her eyes darted to the driveway where her so-called alpha was still writhing, trying to pull himself together. It was almost pitiful, almost she trying to shield herself from the cold window. Reality, what were you thinking?" I asked, stepping closer. My voice was calm, but the weight behind it made her flinch. "Bringing him here into my house." Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She glanced back at the driveway as if hoping her knight in shining armor would recover and say something to save her. "He didn't." I thought, she began, her voice shaky. "I thought you didn't care." That made me stop. I took a deep breath. "I didn't know you didn't know that I interrupted to defend my home and defend myself. You think silence means weakness and that calm means indifference." Her shoulders slumped, and for a moment I saw a flicker of regret in her eyes, but regret wasn't enough. "Not now. You invited this," I continued, gesturing to the driveway where side you thought I'd roll over and let him take everything, my house, my dignity. You underestimated me, and now you're standing here pretending to be shocked. She opened her mouth again, but I held up a hand to stop her. "Don't," I said, "don't try to explain, don't try to justify it, just answer me." I looked back at my spouse and said steadily, "This was your choice. Is here because of you. You have to deal with what happens next because you allowed it to get to this stage." I took a step back as she extended her hand as if to touch my arm. Didn't you do what I asked?" she said, her voice just above a wisp. "You not expect me to remind you of my identity?" Tears streamed down her face as she stood there wordless. For the first time, I saw the cracks in her confidence, the realization that she'd gambled and lost. I walked past her back into the house. I didn't slam the door, I didn't yell, I simply closed it behind me, leaving her to face the wreckage of her choices alone. She wanted me to accept her different. Well, now she'd have to accept mine. Inside the house, Male limped to his car, probably expecting me to shout something to finish him off with a final blow of words. I didn't. Humiliation was complete. My wife stood in the driveway, still frozen in place. She didn't move to help him, didn't call after him. She just stood there, her arms hanging limply at her sides, as if the weight of her decisions had finally caught up with her. I leaned against the counter, sipping my water, letting the silence set. That brought peace. It made you confront every bad choice, every word you shouldn't have said, every action you shouldn't have taken. Eventually she came inside. Her steps were hesitant, like a child sneaking back into the house after breaking curfew. She stopped in the kitchen doorway, her eyes red and swollen. "You didn't have to do so." disrespect me to walk into my house and treat me like nothing. I didn't know he'd act like that, she whispered, wrapping her arms around herself. I didn't think. No, I interrupted, my tone sharper than I intended. You didn't think that's the problem. She flinched, and for a moment I felt a pang of guilt, but it wasn't enough to soften me. Yet I told him to leave, she said after a long pause. I told him it was over. I raised an eyebrow. And that changes what? Just I thought you thought I'd sit back and let him take everything, I said, finishing the sentence for her. You thought I'd accept it because I didn't yell, because I didn't throw a tantrum when you told me about him. She didn't respond. What could she say? The truth was laid bare between us, and there was no way to dress it up, no excuse that would make it any less ugly. I didn't fight him for you. Wanted. This wasn't about you, it was about me, about standing my ground. Her eyes filled with tears again, and she reached out as if to touch my arm. I stepped back, shaking my head. Don't, I said. Not yet, she nodded, biting her lip to keep from sobbing. I turned back to the sink, staring out the window at the now empty driveway. The storm was over, but the aftermath was just beginning. We both knew there were no easy fixes here, no magic words that. The next morning, the sun still rose, the birds still chirped, and the air smelled faintly of dew and freshly cut grass, but inside the air was thick with unspoken words. My wife barely met my eyes, and I wasn't inclined to start a conversation either. I went about my day as if nothing had happened, eating a quiet breakfast and looking at the morning paper. I wasn't surprised. Fights, even quiet ones, rarely stayed contained in small neighborhoods. What probably started as an innocent observation, a strange car in my driveway, had likely snowballed into a juicy neighborhood scandal. By now everyone had their own version of the story. Did you hear he beat his wife's lover senseless and threw him out of the house? Or? I didn't care about the gossip, so I let them talk, but as the day went on, I noticed a change in how people looked at me when I went to get the mail. The man across the street, who hadn't nodded at me in years, raised a hand in acknowledgement and smiled with respect. Another neighbor, an older woman walking her dog, stopped to say hello. Her tone was kind, but her eyes were curious and cautious. I was no longer the quiet guy who minded his own business. I was now the man who stood his ground and defended his pride and home. Admiration wasn't the only reaction. I noticed whispers, hushed conversations that stopped when I walked by, and fleeting looks of pity or judgment from people who had only half the story. I could almost hear their thoughts. What kind of man lets his wife disrespect him like that? Have you noticed the way people are looking at us? I didn't look up from the book I was reading. Let them look, I said. She stopped pacing, her arms crossed defensively. You don't care? I set the book down, meeting her gaze. Care about what they think? They weren't the ones who invited chaos into my house. Her face crumpled slightly, and she looked away. It's not about them, I continued. It's about you. About. I don't know what to do, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I leaned back in my chair, studying her in sharp contrast to the confident woman who had previously informed me that she was seeing someone else, as if it were a casual change of plans. She appeared petite, almost frail. I had to reassure her that everything would be okay for a moment, but that was no longer my responsibility. I picked up my. After the driveway incident, the days were calm, but not in a pleasant way. It was the weighty type of silence where every second is tense and laced with unsaid dialogue. My wife used to walk around the home with a casual ease, but suddenly she didn't seem to know where she belonged. She avu most of her time in the bedroom or kitchen, as if seeing me reminded her of what she'd done. Her eyes momentarily met mine before scurrying away. As we met, I wasn't intentionally avoiding her, but I also wasn't aggressively looking for her. I let her sit alone and experience the full impact of her presence in our lives. First see me to watch her. Her normally flawless stance was now drooping beneath the weight of remorse and guilt, and her shoulders were slumped. She paused before speaking. When she eventually looked up and saw me, she murmured softly, I finished it. I arched an eyebrow but remained silent, allowing her to go on. She clarified with him, as if there were any questions. I admitted, I'm not sure where to start. I didn't think it would go this far. She kept shaking her voice, and I thought you didn't care anymore, that we were just going through the motions. I let her words hang in the air before responding. You thought I didn't care because I didn't shout, throw things, or make a scene, but that's not who I am. No, I messed up, she whispered. I don't want to lose us, but I know I wounded you, and I don't expect you to forgive me. I'd rather not lose you instead of moving me or stirring anything deep inside of me. Her comments left me feeling detached. I'll do whatever it takes, she murmured frantically. Tell me how to fix this, please. I stood up straight and pushed away from the doorway. I have no right to decide that you broke it, thus it's your responsibility to figure out how to fix it, if it can be fixed at all. She was alone at the table, crying and regretting. If I wanted to help her fix what she broke, it was her burden, not mine. I didn't intentionally make her life unpleasant in the weeks that followed. I didn't need to. I was already feeling the weight of her ex's shame, which made every room she walked into feel heavier. I focused on taking back the parts of my life that had felt stale, ignored, or eclipsed by marriage. Runs and spending time at the neighborhood gym reminded me of my former self, a man with strength, discipline, and control. She made an effort in the interim, as shown by the way she hovered around the kitchen while I cooked and by the small notes she left expressing regret for her behavior. She was cautious not to push too hard, unclear how to mend the rift she had caused. Quiet attempts at reconciliation came in waves, but she wasn't done yet. She arranged the living room with blankets and popcorn like we used to, brought home my favorite meal from a place we used to love, and suggested we watch one of our favorite movies together. I participated, but emotionally I stayed out of it. I didn't dismiss her outright or ignore her. And it worked, but it wasn't ostentatious or theatrical. Every day she was compelled to sit with the pain of facing the results of her decisions. I had been putting off cleaning the garage for months, but one afternoon I decided to do it. I found an album of pictures from our early years together. While sorting through dusty shelves and old boxes, I saw the smiles, happy moments, and life we had created before everything fell apart. As I turned, her eyes softened as she saw the album in my hands, and for a brief moment it seemed as though the burden of all that separated us had been removed. With a hint of melancholy in her voice, she muttered, "I miss those days." I stared at her as I closed the album. "I agree, but you took a decision that distanced us, Fro. Did you do it because there were 100 ways to deal with boredom without inviting someone else into our house? If that was the only reason." She paused and let out a long sigh. She acknowledged that I was scared that we had become estranged without realizing it, and I chose to act foolishly rather than speak with you about it. I reasoned that we would both wake up if I made you envious of me. Justified her behavior. I clearly stated that I wasn't asleep. Yes, I was. I gave my all to this marriage every day, and you didn't wake me up. You broke something that might never be fixed. She wiped her face and cried quietly. "Even if you don't believe me now, I'll keep trying," she said softly. I nodded, picking up the photo album and putting it back in the box. "We'll see," I said in a steady voice that it wasn't for us. The house felt breathable again, and the tension, though not gone, had subsided into something more manageable and quiet. My wife kept trying to fix what she had damaged. The way she held herself now, no longer overconfident, but thoughtful, cautious, and conscious of the fragility of what was left between us, showed me that she was sincere. I was introspecting as well. My rage had burned itself away, leaving an odd clarity. I didn't want to forgive Bu. Resentment and holding on to that fury indefinitely was tiresome and heavy like a stone in my chest. She came with 2 cups of tea one evening when I was sitting on the back porch. Without saying anything, she put one in front of me and sat down, folding her hands in her lap. We spent some time listening to the crickets and the sound of leaves rustling in the wind. I thought love would always be easy, that it would always feel new and exciting like it did. "I'm aware that I caused you pain," she said, "but I need you to know that I've learned from my mistake, even though I know I abused your trust in an irreversible way, and I don't expect you to forgive me out of desire. I've changed, and I'll continue to fight for what we had if there's even the slightest chance we might recreate it." I doubted that things would ever return to normal when she turned to face me, her eyes wide and eager, and I said honestly in a low voice, "But I'm willing to try, not for what we had before, but for something better, something stronger." "Is that what you mean?" I took a sip of the tea she had prepared and nodded. "I do. Work hard." Her voice trembled as she hurriedly said, "I'm ready. Whatever it takes, I'll do it." I felt a little cautious sense of relief for the first time in months. Although it wasn't forgiveness yet, it was the start of something new. In the days that followed, we took walks around the neighborhood that felt less awkward with every step, and had brief conversations over breakfast that didn't end in silence. We started re-establishing the foundation. Decision to continue forward and choose each other in spite of the scars, even though there were still times when we were unsure and felt like the weight of what had happened would pull us back. Once the scene of our biggest battle, the driveway, has come to represent resiliency. Not only had I stood up for my pride there, but we had faced the truth head-on.